Thank you, Pedro. Thank you very much for this invitation. I hope you can see and hear me okay, everybody? Yes, great, fantastic. And lovely to see so many people here and lots of familiar names and a few familiar faces, which is sort of good news and bad news. Good news in the sense that I feel kind of safe and in familiar surroundings, but bad news in that some of you will have heard some of this before, which I guess is another reason to try to keep the first part fairly brief so that I can go into your questions, because if one thing's for certain, it's that you haven't all heard all of each other's questions before, although there may be some common ground. So I'll start by sort of introducing myself and explaining the journey that I went on, and this sort of slightly intriguing title of analysis meeting acting, and to situate where I see the task and what we're doing, which I think will help when I come on to the questions. So right now, I'm a conference interpreter working mainly at the EU with English A, Spanish B, French, Italian, Portuguese C languages. So fairly typical sort of EU work in that I'm in the English booth working into my mother tongue, but I work in bilateral meetings between English and Spanish, which I guess is a lot more similar to what a lot of people are doing in the Americas and specifically in Chile. And because I work into my B language quite often, I share your pain. So I know what it is like to try to work into a non-native language. I was trained in-house by the European Commission. So I was trained directly by the people I went on to work alongside. And I do work on the private market now. And that is mainly into Spanish. So I do have a range of professional activities. But before I became an interpreter, I was a writer-performer. So I was doing theatre first, and I had languages. I was interested in languages, and then I formalized that. And when I was I got to the end of all the studenty things and any possible excuse for doing pure fun things, including literary translation and touring with performance poetry and things like that. But when the crunch really came to say, how am I going to earn a living, using languages and some kind of performance element seemed attractive. So I went into conference interpreting. And I think that informed my approach. So in those days, there was very much the attitude of not exactly that the interpreter is invisible, but that we personally somehow don't engage. We are a pure channel, and it's as though we as people don't exist. And I found this obviously in huge conflict with the whole ego side of performing, right? But I could see that they were right in the sense that the interpreter's ego really doesn't help with doing a professional job. So that was sort of the status quo. Then I got involved in training, and I started specializing in English Retour training. The main reason for that was the Big Bang enlargement of the European Union about 15 years ago. Suddenly, there were many Central and Eastern European languages which were official languages of the EU, and which there were not enough non-native speakers of who understood those languages. So for Bulgarian to be interpreted for all the other Europeans, it was a Bulgarian interpreter working into a second language like English or French or German. And until then, between Western European languages, it had been fairly, people have been so mobile that people had 2 or 3 languages and could work into mother tongue. So we had to invent a kind of a school of retour interpreting for the EU, where the EU had tried to avoid any non-native interpreting until then. And this was a pragmatic need that it was faced with. The UN had always used retour for Arabic and was now using it for Chinese. And it became a huge thing for Central and Eastern European languages. So as I started doing that, I realized that a lot of what came to me most naturally, what would I do as a public speaker and an English native speaker, was what my Chinese found most fascinating and was what they were most struggling with, because they were thinking in another language, trying to express themselves in English, and it wasn't coming naturally. And so I realized I had something to offer there. As we started developing online materials and I was given a bit more freedom for format, I started combining the two, and my writing and performing life had been completely separate, partly for the reasons I've just described, and then the two started coming together. I already did that a bit as a teacher. So you can imagine your average British languages graduate doing a master's in interpreting, very idealistic, open to languages, believing in peace and cooperation and let's learn about each other's cultures, all of that, absolutely fantastic. But generally, a lack of general knowledge about other cultures and other ways of doing things, and a huge lack of knowledge about the EU institutions and how they work. So I often found that in an interpreting class, instead of saying, here's a speech on the common agricultural policy, interpret from Spanish into English, I'd have to start by saying, this is the common agricultural policy. This is how it works. You need to understand this in your mother tongue before you can understand somebody else speaking in another language and attempt to put it into your mother tongue. And so as that didactic side developed, I was increasingly trying to use imaginative ways to communicate with students, and I inevitably fell back on some degree of comedy because I realized it was such, apart from being fun, it was such an effective way to get information across in a way that would stick by illustrating something, sometimes through caricature, but not necessarily. People could visualize connections and things. So then that went into the online training, and basically all these strands sort of came together in some of the training that I was doing. So I then had to start thinking about whether this division that I'd previously seen was really the case. And the way the two things have come together for me, and this may be helpful in the references I make afterwards, was the school of interpreting I came from first. That's the first reference point I need to lay down. So the Paris School of Conference Interpreter Training of the late 20th century, Seleskovich, and so on. This was the early years of AIC, and it was after the Nuremberg trials, and it was an attempt to formalize what we were doing, particularly between Western European languages where people could work into mother tongue. At any rate, leaving that specific context aside, the crucial aspect for me was what she called la théorie du sens. So the interpretive theory of translation. In a nutshell, ideas, not words. So we do not work with words as interpreters. We use words and many other things to understand ideas, and what we communicate are ideas in another language. Sounds very simple, but if you underpin your training with this, it helps you, for instance, in consecutive already to triangulate so that you are analyzing and you have something else before you are expressing. You go through something, which is not just notes, because notes will only be a representation of the source language. Or if you do notes in the target language, you're doing simultaneous interpreting, making notes to help you with it, and then regurgitating simultaneous with a time lag. It's not consecutive interpreting. So whichever way around, if there's something missing in the middle, it's not consecutive interpreting. Consecutive is what happens in between the analysis and the listening and the expression. So that then is applied to simultaneous with the time lag. The décalage and the reformulation is all about what's happening in the middle. You have listened, and while you are engaging with ideas, something else is happening, which is not listening and is not yet expression. And that, if you like, is the concept of interpreting that I'm working with. But the reason I stress that thing being in the middle is, obviously with the title, analysis meets acting, they don't quite meet in the interpreter because we have this something else going on in the middle. Very often I find to bring this crashing down to earth, since that's all rather theoretical and historical, in Retour Interpreting into English in 2022, 8 times out of 10, when there is a negative first impression of what the interpreter has done, my diagnosis will be that there is a problem at that stage in the middle, possibly with the listening and analysis, because we listen to mother tongue and think it's easy because it's our mother tongue and we're not really analyzing, but somewhere before expression, there has been a problem. And that theory has been borne out in my own work into B, that when I'd always spoken Spanish socially, and it had always been my strongest passive language. When I took the step to make it an official active language, I was concerned about my Spanish. I'm going to be speaking a non-native language. Will I get all the imperfect subjunctives right? Will I get a rhythm of speech that is a Spanish dun, 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 rather than an English up and down and so on? These were the traps I could see and that I wanted to avoid. And that was my obsession, was keeping my head above water. I see several people nodding. This is our B language obsession, right? Will I keep my head above water and sound okay amongst native speakers? What I completely underestimated was the challenge of understanding English. I'd never had to understand English professionally. I thought I knew English because it was my mother tongue, and I discovered that most people don't speak English the way I speak English, for a start. Secondly, even if they speak it the way I speak it, they might not be thinking the same way. So I'd hugely underestimated that. So that can be one element. But this analysis is sort of happening somewhere in the middle. And we often think expression is the big challenge. And once we start analyzing people's expression and choices, was this the right word or the wrong word? For instance, if we take the word-based approach, answering the question, was that the right word, actually requires the analysis of the original. And so often the dilemma about English words from an English B is a false dilemma, because the real dilemma is the analysis of the idea. And even with imperfect English expression, a non-native with severely limited, restricted expression, very often the dilemma that they're facing is one of two ideas which they are capable of expressing in simple English, but they're failing to express because they haven't clearly done the analysis as to which idea they're trying to express, or they're focusing wrongly and are obsessed with expression and are trying to be too ambitious with English expression and are devoting most of their effort to English expression to the extent that they're not doing enough of the analysis of the message, and the analysis is suffering. So for one reason or another, it is very often the analysis which is the key to improving a retour. English expression, one's B language expression can always infinitely be improved throughout one's professional lifetime, of course, but we need to be clear where we're starting from and what the priorities are. The connection I make with the training of an actor, which is what I do in sort of seminars on the skills of an actor and interpreting and things like that, is Stanislavski. So this is now going back even further into history, late 19th century Russian theatre school, St. Petersburg, and revolutionizing really how we think about training actors, particularly what the actor is trying to do, and therefore how we train them. So I have a parallel there with the ideas, not words, the revolution in the concept of interpreting in Paris in the late 20th century. And again, to try to make it modern and relevant, this is still what people generally mean by method acting in Hollywood. So the actor's studio in Hollywood is still basically doing what Stanislavski described. And there are still big Hollywood names who will go off and try to immerse themselves in aspects of their character's existence in order to somehow make it real. Now, that is a rather superficial sort of manifestation, if you like, but it's all connected to the idea that we as actors need to connect with something authentic in ourselves. It's not enough just to do artificial tricks. That's the Stanislavski, pre-19th century acting. You walk on stage and everything is very exaggerated. You are acting, everything is a show. You don't really believe it. That's what the theatre is all about. And what he does is get people to access real emotions. So the sort of stereotypical thing is the character is crying, so you remember the last thing that really upset you. Nobody knows what's in your head. Nobody knows the thing in your head is different to the thing in the character's head, People see the consequence on your face and in your gestures, and they believe it because you are really feeling it. So that connection is linked to the motivation in both cases. So the actor needs to know the motivation, not what does my character say, but why does my character say it? That's what you need to know in order to prepare the role, because you have to understand not what you're feeling. Now be sad. Nobody can do that. No director ever says to an actor, be sad now, right? Just like you can't say to an interpreter, these are some Spanish words, now say these words in English. That, you know, that I know that anyone working in court interpreting in the US, apparently that is what you're asked to do. So apologies to anyone who finds that they are literally asked to do verbatim. But for the understanding of the profession that I was describing earlier of ideas, this is where the two meet. So something like the inner truth. David Mamet, the US playwright, said, people may or may not say what they mean, but they always say something designed to get what they want. And that's advice for actors, but I think it can help with interpreter training too, that if we stop thinking about what the speaker says and we stop trying to say what the speaker says, and we start thinking about why the speaker says it, then obviously we don't forget about what they say, but we will understand what they are saying in a deeper way. If we understand why they're saying it, we will understand how they're saying it in a deeper way if we understand why they're saying it. And we can then take an informed decision about what to say and how to say it in another language. And the huge danger I see with Retour is that you're hearing words, and if you don't do this deep analysis, then what you think you are trying to say is in fact not meaningful to your listener, because it is not authentic. It is not authentically linked to what anybody wants to say. It's just some words. So those are the sort of underlying principles. Perhaps one thing to add on the challenges, I don't want to sound like I'm being really harsh and judgmental about Retour. I've already shared some of my own pain with the process. And I really, really sympathize with people who are called upon to do it from the beginning of their careers. And I think that requires some extra understanding and preparation. And so I don't want to sound like I'm being over demanding, for instance, of people who are just completing their studies now, who are maybe ready to go onto the market. I think it's almost impossible to be ready when you haven't had the life experience in the other language. So I'm not saying you have to be a method actor, and you know, if you're going to interpret the company accounts, you have to go and live undercover as an English-speaking accountant for 3 months until that completely takes over your life in order to sound authentic. But you have to sort of fake that in some way or another. So mock conferences, simulations of the professional environment where you wear different hats, I think can be absolutely crucial to that, so that you start to have this exposure. And in that way, it's not just linguistic immersion. It's not just a focus on expression, because you could end up with a paradox. Let's say, if to sort of caricature for a moment, you have a really typically over-the-top Latin stereotype speaker with some circumlocution and some bombastic rhetoric. And you have, as part of your linguistic enhancement, you listen to some wisecracking American who's incredibly dense and has these little throwaway punchy remarks, and maybe a Brit with some understatement and irony and whatever. How do you make all of these things fit together? How does that actually help you as an interpreter with a bombastic Latin speaker? You have to create a bombastic English speaker. You have to create a character yourself, which requires your imagination. So it's not a jigsaw puzzle where you just copy things from different people. Like an actor, you have some ingredients given to you, and you have some direction given to you by the director, which would be the context of the conference, the pragmatics of what are people achieving from this negotiation, from the rhetoric, from this event. You have all of that context, but then ultimately it is your imagination and your emotional intelligence that will lead you to a meaningful response. And that's quite sophisticated. I think it's quite natural, and it's in a way easier to develop quickly than an encyclopedic knowledge. So this is where I want to be very sort of optimistic for people starting out, because I think this is a quick fix. If you can change the way of thinking in this way and develop that empathy and that emotional intelligence, even if your English is limited, and even if your subject matter knowledge is not encyclopedic yet, if you understand why people say things in order to get what they want from a situation, that will give you a huge leap forward. And it is all connected. Actually understanding that can be subject matter specific too. So the way a scientist presents evidence of what has happened and possible conclusions about causation, for instance, is done in a disciplined way because of the way they've studied science. But you, if you haven't studied science and you're a linguist through and through and you're starting your career, you can apply the motivation approach. How they say it is because of why they say it, which is because of a scientific method. You actually discover that scientific method through analyzing their motivation. And once you've got it, you apply it, and it will generally serve you well in all of those contexts. So once you start applying the method, the Stanislavski method, together with the Seleskovich method, those two methods together will actually prepare you for any situation. You will be less experienced and less knowledgeable about the situations you face. But my sneaky, provocative, intergenerational tip now for you is that if you manage to apply that method intelligently, you will respond to new situations with greater flexibility and greater intelligence than the most experienced interpreter who is stuck in a routine and a habit which is purely based on their knowledge and which does not include a method which allows them to learn and grow in this way. That can be your secret weapon to give you some extra confidence when you have imposter syndrome, which we all have in certain contexts when we're facing a new subject or a new set of people. So that's the positive point I wanted to end with. I'll take a handful of questions because we've got a lot, and then we'll maybe open it up a bit to have a little conversation, and then I'll take a few more of the pre-prepared questions. I'll go into maybe the training and practice questions. They were very handily grouped for me by Pedro. Thank you very much for that. So since I was talking about that now, I'll deal with these. So I have Renzo Lara Perez from France, deliberate practice techniques. So deliberate practice, that's a step beyond what I've just been talking about. So to define deliberate practice, we decide what the aim is. So I would also follow a method perhaps for deliberate practice, defining the aim of the practice and then the parameters, and then we can do the kind of role play that I described in developing the character. I think playing the customer, playing the speaker, playing the checker are all interesting roles. So basically any role that you could imagine someone having in your professional environment, somebody needs you completely. They don't understand a word of the original. What does that actually feel like to be that person? Be that person. That's how to find out. So you play the role of the pure customer. What's it like to be a bilingual who's paid good money for an interpreter and suspects that maybe they're not giving much added value, are you really an evil monster who's trying to destroy the profession? Or are you just a human being who's really more interested in the specialized topic of the conference and just wants to check that the interpreting is going okay? Either way, find out. Be that person. Be that person to understand better why people are checking and what they're doing when they're checking or criticizing or whatever it may be. What is their motivation? When you understand that, that will help you. So basically, I'd apply that same method to every possible situation. Role play. Preparing for a specific conference, I would tend to move away from the traditional glossary-based approach. So glossaries tend to be abstract nouns of equivalence. Obviously, for technical topics, that can be extremely useful. So I'm not saying that's not useful for vocabulary, but vocabulary is not the only aspect of a conference. And I would say the same thing, the role play as to who wants what. So is there a negotiation? Is there an aim from the exercise? Is it for one side to pass information to the other side, simply to convince people of a position? Is it political? Is it financial? Whatever it may be, that your research into the motivation, I think, can then you can do the imaginative thing of saying, I understand what the Spanish-speaking side wants, and I know how they speak, for example, if you're in that situation. So create a fictional English-speaking character and say, I'm going to create this, Bill Smith character who is the equivalent, who would want this. I don't know who they are. I don't know who it will be at the conference, but my preparation will be a 5-minute presentation by this fictional character, speaking freely, but using the method and using your insights. And you may then find that that is a good rehearsal for the voice that you will be using on mic. You will also be slightly more confident being the person who talks about this topic on mic. You don't want the very first sentence you ever say about nuclear physics into a microphone to be the one key introduction by the world expert. You want to have said something else first to kind of play around with it, just like an actor warming up. So you can do a warm-up exercise where you have a little debate with your classmates and you play these roles. I've talked about vocabulary, I think, and starting. Nice one, Denise Ochoa, listening to myself without being too critical. This is one of the keys to self-confidence, and it's something which actors have. So again, I think the role play, that makes it sound like it's sort of a half empathy, that you're listening to yourself with somebody else's ears, but ultimately you're so self-conscious that you don't complete that exercise and you end up being self-critical. Really believe the positive feedback, because sometimes we let our self-perception, and this is a point for the other end of the spectrum too, so probably for everybody, don't let your self-perception predominate over other people's perceptions. Listen to other people's perceptions and develop that empathy. You can't let it paralyze you either, but in fact, a way of getting to the self-confidence is to also believe the positive. If a pure customer says, thank you, I got something from you that I would not have got otherwise because I don't speak the language, don't say, but most of that vocabulary wasn't right, and it would have been better if you'd been listening to a native speaker. That is not the right reply. Right reply is, good, I'm pleased you got something from me. I'm doing my job okay. Right? It's not arrogant to do that. That it's a basic. Somebody else doesn't understand. Now, thanks to you, they do. Maybe there was another way of saying it. Fine. That is still an achievement. So celebrating the small achievements is also a way to progress. And if you listen to yourself and you notice things that you think could be irritating or distracting that get in the way of the message, then get a second opinion. And if a second opinion confirms it, this is great, because this means you are very sensitive to how other people hear you, and you will therefore make very quick progress at changing it. So instead of beating yourself up about it, you can congratulate yourself on your sensitivity. Some people go through their entire career without ever realizing how awful they sound to everybody else. So if you realize how awful you sound, celebrate that fact. That's an achievement as well in itself. And when I say awful, obviously a distraction is relative. What you want is for the message to come through. And so if you do think, I want to change my relationship with my voice and with the listener's perception for the sake of the message, then you're doing what I've been talking about more generally. These are the exercises where analysis meets acting, where your voice becomes more in tune with the source speaker's message, and you don't have so many distractions. So lots of different things going on there, some of which we can come back to, but maybe it's a good time to open it up a little bit and see whether, firstly, whether I've made sense so far, and secondly, whether we should go into any of these avenues a little bit more. Pedro.
Okay, great. So if anyone has a question, please raise your Zoom hand, and I will ask that person to unmute. Matthew has more questions from you, though. Okay, but the idea is to also have a sort of conversation. Okay, and I think I will be the first. You know, I will be the first to break the ice. So, Matthew, one of the quotes I think I'll print in my classroom and I will put it on the wall is why the speaker says what he's saying. Okay. And just yesterday I was having a conversation with one of my students, and we were talking about that. I mean, we are told and we tell our trainees that we interpret intentions, and that intentions will have everything to do with the final decision we make when it comes to saying one word over the other, or one structure over the other, or conveying the message differently from other times. How can I tell them to listen to me when it comes to why the speaker is saying what he's saying? I mean, how can I make them believe me? I know they will find it out eventually with practice. It comes with practice. But how can I make them notice this before they make some mistakes that are completely unavoidable? And I know that we learn from mistakes as well. But sometimes, especially in this career, mistakes are really painful and frustrating. And you are usually quite affected because of a bad interpreting. So do you have any ideas to do
that? Yes. So this is a point for trainers, I guess, for the training method. And I'm going to say something which can be even more frustrating for trainers, because it's so fundamental to the system, which is change the system, in fact. So pedagogically, I think you need to have a different approach from the start. So this is like that old joke about somebody asks for directions in the street and you say, well, I wouldn't start from here, right? So I think if you're in a situation where the students are wrongly focusing, in your view, on aspects of content and what is being said at the expense of things like intention, then I think the students have already gone down a wrong path in a way. And what we need to do maybe next year is be more careful at the beginning of the path about where we're going. So as with any exercise, I'm always tempted whenever a trainer says the trainee is failing. I mean, this is a situation that I constantly face. And when you're an examiner too, somebody gets to the end of the course and they fail. So what does that mean? And how do we measure it? You can have a professional yardstick and you just say you should have got here. But if you're guiding somebody and taking them step by step, then you have a joint responsibility for going through those steps. And therefore, to me, the crucial thing is how you define things in the first place. So one example would be in class. This is maybe a more common example that I can extrapolate from. So in class, you say to somebody, okay, you said most of the content, but it didn't sound very convincing. So my main criticism of your work is you don't sound convincing. You need to sound more convincing. Now, that could be not valid pedagogically if that's the first time you mention sounding convincing in the classroom, because the student is doing what you've asked them to do. You didn't ask them to sound convincing, but now the criticism is that they didn't. And that is not pedagogical. So the pedagogical approach is to say, in today's class, I want you to listen to this speech and I want you to try to reproduce the content in another language, but I want you to pay particular attention to how this sounds, because the aim of the speaker is to convince the Spanish-speaking audience. Your aim at every moment in your interpretation is to convince the English-speaking audience. Every time you move to a new section in your notes, in your consecutive, remember, am I convincing my audience or not? Go. And if the student does not sound convincing, you can then say, can I ask you the question, did you, every time you moved from one section to another, remember, my main purpose is to convince my English-speaking audience? Maybe they forgot because they were nervous, because they haven't done it before. Whatever the reason why they didn't do it, it could be a learning experience for next time. But you've set the ground rules. You've said, this is what we were trying to do. Now let's look at why we failed to do it. So to extrapolate slightly from that to focusing on motivation, I think there's been it was always difficult. I always had difficulty in a face-to-face classroom creating simulations. You have to create the communication situation in which the motivation is clear within one language. So I think step by step, you need maybe, and again, it's really easy for me to say because it's like, don't start from here. So, but off the top of my head, this is what, if somebody said, can you design a course to achieve this? I would say in the first few weeks, you can have an exercise which is purely in Spanish, which is about things like motivation. So person A, your job, your life's purpose is to convince everybody that smoking isn't so bad after all. Person B, you actually have some science and you can tell us why we shouldn't smoke. But person A, you're going to lose a lot of money if people stop smoking. You really, really have to persuade us to smoke. So you do a role-playing exercise. You don't have any other language involved. You let the conversation play. You decide whether it is authentic, whether there is real motivation, or whether it's just some words, whether it's really logical, whether it's really internally consistent. And every single time, internally consistent. Why? Because we have a motivation. Everything is explained by the motivation. Why is there an example? Because the example helps with the motivation. So everything comes back to that within one language. And the next week, you can say, okay, we're doing the same thing, but now we have to listen to an English version of each thing. So we really firmly establish what is happening, isolating that from interpreting. We then put it into the interpreting context, and then we have a strong edifice which has already been established of what it is we're trying to do. If it is destroyed by interpretation, we can go back to the monolingual edifice. But if we've never created it, then it is all an abstract idea for the students, which means they're trying to do something that may be difficult for them to visualize.
Hi, Matthew. It's good to hear you and see you again. As a trainer, I don't want to be the party pooper here, because we've been talking about developing tools and going the extra mile, everything. I love what you're saying, and I'm totally 100% on the same page. But sometimes as a trainer, you have to be the person in charge of delivering the bad news. And sometimes students are not equipped with the right tools to start doing this. And it's very frustrating to deliver those news. I mean, you have to say, I'm sorry, but it's very difficult for you to achieve a level of proficiency and do all these things and mimic the motivation and do a good service for the client if you simply don't have the goods. So what's the minimum toolkit that you need to start thinking about doing retour in a professional, decent way?
Thank you. Well, I think probably define everything you've just said in a relative sense rather than an absolute sense, because all of my experience in retour training would indicate that there can never be an absolutely good retour, not least because there are A-language interpreters out there. So in absolute terms, there is no justification for retour. It will always be relative, and it won't be relative to the A language. It'll be relevant to not having interpretation. And so one key way of explaining this to a student would be to say, try to convey the message to somebody as to why that version has not met what might seem like an arbitrary standard, is to say the criterion is, does the customer feel on balance that they've benefited from having an interpreter? Because if you, on balance, you're confused and it hasn't really helped, then maybe it would have been better to say, sorry, can you speak a bit of English? Even if it's really bad, can we just try in English? And if you say, oh, thank goodness there's an interpreter, then it's okay. But if you say, no, actually, maybe it's easier without the interpreter, then you have a problem. So it's relative. What is it relative to? Also, the other point is chronological. I've been the bearer of bad tidings myself at final exams already this summer. And one approach that I take is that it is very, very time specific. I know many successful interpreters who failed some exam at some point in their training or in their early years. And sometimes they're much better than people who sail through everything and have the failures in their professional life, let's say, rather than in their academic life. So saying the aim of the exercise today was for you to demonstrate that you are ready today to do A, B, and C. And you didn't demonstrate A, B, and C today. And then you can be honest and say, I've definitely seen potential for you to do A. So in time, you can probably do that. And you may have the potential to do B and C or whatever. So there you can be honest. And sometimes people go into translation or go into public communications training or liaison, informal stuff. There are kind of professional activities related to what we do where some of the skills can be useful. They don't have the right set for what we're doing, but they can also come back and try again. And perhaps finally, I made the point to Pedro just now about kind of going back and the starting point. So aptitude, do we really know what it takes to become an interpreter? Can we really spot a potential interpreter before they've started their training? Research is inconclusive on that. We all have instincts, of course, and changing mother tongue, changing the way of thinking when you've been got into the habit of thinking a certain way for many years can be extremely difficult. But when you can still be molded and pushed in new directions, if you have an open mind and a willingness to learn, then there is often potential there. So again, I'd say we need the parameters to define very, very closely what the criteria are, especially if they're relative. And in that way, we're not delivering some awful, huge bad news. We're delivering a quite specific message about a specific circumstance.
Olivia Ocana Quintana, please.
Hi, Pedro. Thank you. I wanted also to thank Matthew for the wonderful presentation. It's always a joy to listen to you. I have a couple of questions, but in order to be fair to everybody, I'll just start with one. And it's going back to analysis and It might be a silly question, but what to do when there is nothing to analyze? Like, what about when the speaker, rambles on and on, when you cannot really make, I don't know. Now I'm thinking that maybe I'm not listening attentively enough. Like maybe there is actually something there. So that's the question. What about when there's no structure to analyze?
Yeah, excellent question. I've come up against this a lot, and I have this with several of my languages in several cultural contexts. So I don't know if I'll try not to be specific because it can sound culturally insensitive. Let's say and I think this will apply to several contexts, the way law is taught in cultures where there's a legacy of sort of Roman concepts, there can be a quite embedded concept of not exactly circumlocution, but of presenting aspects that relate indirectly to a main point in a way that can sometimes seem that you never really approach the main point. And it doesn't only apply to law. It can apply to public speaking generally. It can apply to the concept of elegant public speaking generally. And it can apply to English public speaking. And if you watch kind of the old sitcom Yes Minister and things like that, you can see how in the British civil service, there was also a culture of not saying things, of deliberately not saying things. We have constructive ambiguity in diplomacy as well, regardless of the nationality and the cultural background. But specifically, and I think in the Spanish-English combination, this is something we can have, that there are definitely moments I notice when it seems that the speaker has almost got an automatic concatenation of formulations without a huge amount of substance as we would perceive it in other contexts. So what to do? Right. I go back to the relative argument, I think, that we start with what sounds like an absolute rule. So let's say that in simultaneous technique, I am advocating reformulation, salami technique. Keep it simple, because your sentences from Spanish are huge and unmanageable. And okay, they are huge and maybe unmanageable in the original, but somehow the speaker lands on their feet and they make it sound elegant for a Spanish-speaking audience. What comes out in English is not manageable and it is not elegant, and everybody thinks the interpreter is kind of out of control, right? Let's give that hypothesis for a situation. So as a trainer, as a retour trainer, I might say what we need to do is get back in control. So we need to chop. So we need to isolate elements and then give self-contained sentences in English and say who does what. And that can be a minimal amount. So a pesar de las reflexiones que habían compartido algunos en anteriores ocasiones, que hasta cierto punto se podría reconocer que aunque otros hayan expresado el punto de vista contrario, sin embargo, en este caso, ya lo digo hasta cierto punto, porque no es exclusivamente este el único objetivo de la reunión de hoy. Can one extract anything? Well, there are certain factual statements about the fact that some people have said some things previously. So in the example I just gave, you might be able to say, some people said we could do this a different way. It's not all crystal clear as to how we should go about this now. And these are rather non-committal statements. I'm not saying it's black and white. I'm not saying this is the speaker's opinion. I am hedging my bets a little bit, but I'm doing it in a grammatically complete and elegant way in the English language. So that would be my tip in those situations. And that this works a lot of the time. If there is actually more substance, great. But if it's, unlike the German delegation who last time expressed whatever, you can just say, last time Germany said X. We don't have the unlike, we don't have the logical connector with the speaker's opinion yet. We keep that back because it's too complex. So we just spit out the factual statement. Germany said that last time. However, I think and we bring in the logical connector a little bit later. So that will work in many, many situations. But even doing this in some depth with very experienced interpreters, there will be moments when they will say there isn't yet a fully formed, clear idea in the original. So the simultaneous interpreter, according to my absolute technique, my rule, do not say anything until you have one clearly formed idea or fact to share. We don't even have that. So according to my absolute rule, we have complete silence from the booth until we get the first nugget of information. That can be perceived as, let's say, disrespectful, or a technical problem that you haven't switched on. I can't hear the interpretation, etc., etc. All sorts of reasons why that's problematic. But I still maintain that in conceptual terms, that is interpretation. The reason it is problematic is not related to the interpretation. It is related to showing respect for the speaker and for the audience and demonstrating that there isn't a technical problem, etc., which are valid reasons, but they're not interpreting related reasons. And I think if we are clear in our minds that sometimes we do things for other reasons, so there is an aesthetic and technical justification for saying something before we know what we are talking about. So we use a filler. So we will say something which is less than non-committal, which is really rather meaningless. So I'd like to share a few thoughts with you. Or now, how should I put this exactly? If your tone of voice fits, if it's elegant, if it sounds like an intelligent person who's playing for time, and you think that is not inappropriate, given what the original speaker was doing, then we can use that. The absolutely crucial thing, I think, for answering the question is that in our minds, we are disciplined and we are clear as to what is interpreting and what is a filler. The big danger is to think, I have to start interpreting. So you try to interpret something which you do not understand and which is not a complete idea to you. And if you do that, the huge danger is that what you say in English will say too much. You will be putting words in the mouth of the speaker which weren't there. So that's why I think the discipline of separating the two can lead to an aesthetically, technically, politically acceptable solution, but respecting the principles of interpreting. Again, easy to say, but you can practice.
Thank you so much. Donatella, please.
Hi, can you hear me?
Perfect.
Okay.
Perfect.
Mr. Matthew, I apologized. I connected late, but I have a real quick question. When we are supposed to have like a quick analysis of the speaker to try to understand the intention and try to reflect it, that decision must be made in a split second. So how do we train for that? To analyze and really grapple what is in the intention of the speaker and try to convey it? How do we train for that?
I think part of the answer is what I was saying to Pedro earlier of separating out the different skills. So you can, because so many things are going on at once, as you say, in simultaneous. I mean, that is one reason why I would do consecutive first with trainees, not because consecutive in itself is necessarily going to be part of your professional life, but because you're taking out one of the problems, which is everything happening at once. So you can look at what is happening, and thanks to the time lag, you can analyze what is happening at the different points. And if that line of reasoning makes sense to you, then perhaps you can apply that even further back to separating public speaking from analysis. So not only do you have a time lag before you do your own expression, maybe you don't do any expression on that particular occasion. You are a speaker and or a listener, but in a meaningful way. So before asking to put it another way, before asking the simultaneous interpreter what the intention is, ask the consecutive interpreter what the intention is. And before asking the consecutive interpreter what the intention is, ask somebody who's just speaking to a monolingual audience what their intention is. And before even doing that, pick an intention yourself and give your own speech and think about how you were consciously reflecting your intention in your own speech. That's the purest form. And then we can go from that purest form into all the manifestations it can take. And then when we're in the booth, we're not trying to do so many different things at once because we've consolidated, if you like, those different skills.
This is really, really interesting. Really, really interesting. Well, we've been talking about training, okay, and I will role play a little bit. Okay, you've mentioned it, so I think it's important to have a practical exercise. I'm putting myself in the shoes of a senior student, senior interpreting trainee, who is about to enter the market. It's filled with anxiety and fears and uncertainties. So I'm here to ask you for a piece of advice. I mean, what can you tell a senior student, especially in these moments? I mean, they are filled with uncertainties, insecurities. They may not feel prepared enough. They may not feel ready. In the case of Chile, this is undergraduate courses. They are 23, 24 years old. And what can you tell them so that they can, well, face this new stage in life?
One thing that's hard about that for me is I don't know what that stage in life will actually be like. So I can't say, you know, I work in this field and this is what I've seen. One thing with remote, I think, is that being digital natives, the next generation is often more at ease with using platforms than the older generation, but maybe lacking in the face-to-face skills for the empathy and other things that I've mentioned, which previous generations developed through being in the room with people and being in conferences with people. Now that might sound like that being discouraging because I'm saying another thing which you're not ready for. But actually, because nobody has had that, and because people with experience have also been deprived of it for a couple of years, I think it's an area where everybody's a little bit uncertain and cautious. And so one of my main sort of pieces of advice for people who say they're feeling insecure or cautious about something is not to say you shouldn't be, you're fine, you're perfect, but to say everybody else is really too, you know, you think everybody else is more confident than you, but actually everybody's thinking, I haven't been inside a conference room for 2 years. What do I do? How does it work? And how do people relate to one another? If you have the energy and the enthusiasm of starting out and researching what is going on, I think you can very quickly become a very helpful ally to people in a professional environment because you're open-minded about what they need. We're in a period of flux. Everything's being redefined, the way we work, the way we meet, and therefore the way we meet multilingually and the way we interpret. Because that is being redefined, that makes old people like me insecure. But to look at it from the positive point of view for younger people, if everybody's insecure and if everything is being redefined, you're not out of the loop because there is no loop. You are going to be playing more of a role defining the new loop than people who are already there. So you can look for older allies, mentors, more experienced mentors who have the bits that you are missing from that face-to-face experience, and you can learn from them. And it's not one way because you will have in turn have something to offer them, which is this openness to different ways of working, which nobody has got used to yet. Also, perhaps in terms of the first few steps professionally, to take it step by step, I think high-level conference interpreting is not something that anybody wants to stumble into immediately. Anyway, I mean, you may dream of doing that, but the experience itself is one where you want to approach it perhaps indirectly in some ways. And so the other communication-related fields that I was talking about can be introductions to that. A very pragmatic way of looking at it: where do you want to be in 5 years? Rather than where do you want to be next month, where do you want to be in 5 years? What is your market? Who are you working for? What do you specialize in? What language have you added, perhaps? Or which areas are you specializing in if it's a different focus? And that can also give you that motivation for those first few months and the confidence. What are you especially into? Are there people out there who need interpreters in that field? And that can give you a direction. Question here was about applying retour techniques to other languages. I don't know how many people would be interested in this, but I find this absolutely fascinating because I think there are aspects of what are we talking about, that it can be helpful to separate the language specific from the questions of principle. And I don't think this has really been done yet. I don't think there is a definition of universal retour skills. In the same way, there isn't really a definition of universal interpreting. But the closer we get to it, the more helpful it is, I think, especially for training. So to take the classic example of the sort of stereotype, let's say, of the wordy going around the subject, Spanish speaker, supposedly pithy English speaker, although I've said we have lots of tradition of circumlocution in English too. But once we started examining that and the techniques to use, I think we did talk about universal techniques. So the self-protection technique of, I will say the minimum that will not cause me trouble later, that will not commit me and not put words in the speaker's mouth. That, in a sense, is a universal principle of interpreting. It's a bit like the doctor's principle of, do no harm, that the interpreter similarly should, you may not always be able to help, but at the least you should do no harm. You shouldn't make matters worse for communication. And we do sort of move towards those with the voice too, I think, that to pick up on another question, which I think was Donatello, who may have left actually, but she was saying she would follow the recording of acting skills, how to know when it's enough. And there's several questions along these lines too, of, what going too far, is this enough, or what to introduce? And I hope, well, let me start by dwelling slightly on that concept of it is a sort of an extra that you do. And this is a bit like the mentality that I was describing when I entered the profession, that people would see this as being somehow the ego, the performer's ego in the interpreting environment, and it being inappropriate. So suddenly being histrionic, even the adjective histrionic in English has a negative connotation. It is already inappropriate by definition to be histrionic. And I get a similar thing about voice, and I've had this difficulty in China quite often, that there is more of a content focus and written language focus. But I think in many cultures, written language is perceived as being superior to spoken language. So it is the text that counts. It is the contract in black and white. It is the quote from the famous source, the famous academic source, which is valid, not what somebody says that is less valid. In religion, it is the holy book, which is valid, not the human interpretation, etc., etc. So there's a long cultural tradition in most parts of the world of giving that supremacy to the spoken word, which can lead in interpreting and translator training, when the two are combined, to seeing our role as mere verbalization of what is already a valid written form. And my approach is to start with the voice as the instrument, that the listener perceives a voice and then deciphers the voice in order to understand a message, and then gets an idea which is comprised of words. So because the listener perceives it in that order, if we think in that order, rather than I've got some words, now I'm going to say them, we're communicating in a different way. All of which leads me to the conclusion that the voice is not an added extra, it's not an optional extra, and it is therefore not an extra that you can overdo and that can be excessive, because it is an intrinsic part of communication. So therefore, the kind of acting that I'm talking about, which is respecting motivation and respecting the role of the speaker as defined by the speaker, not as defined by us, the speaker's own definition of their own intention as manifested in the source language. If that is what we mean by acting, being true to that, then it can never be excessive, because it is always directly in relationship to the speaker and our audience, to our audience's perception. I think it's only when we become self-conscious of it that it becomes excessive. So that would be the example from acting. If you're watching an actor on stage and you suddenly become aware that they are acting, right? They're doing some acting, and then they're not. It's not working because you're not seeing the character. If you see the actor, not the character, then they're not acting. They're failing to act. So what looks like excessive acting is a failure to act, truly act. And I would say that this, whenever we perceive some kind of excessive use of the voice or whatever it may be, that is actually a failure to use the voice as an interpreter in the true interpreting sense.
Okay, very nice. We have 10-15 minutes left. Okay. Is there anything else you would like to ask? We have students here. Please feel free to ask whatever you want. We don't got to hug the microphone, so feel free to do it.
While people are thinking, maybe I can throw in one thing which is not on the content, but just so I don't forget before I go. So in the meantime, start preparing your questions, especially students, to say, please stay in touch. You can, if we run out of time or you think of something later, you can get in touch with me via my social media. I'm quite happy to be contacted and we can continue the conversation. So do say hi. And on humor, several questions about comedy and interpreting humor. So there, if you haven't looked at the videos yet, Lourdes de Rioja's channel, A Word in Your Ear, I've got a video on interpreting jokes there where I try to look at it from the perspective of a comedian and an interpreter and kind of distinguish between the two, combine the two. So I would refer the comedy points to that. And if the video doesn't answer the questions, then get back to me. And the worst interpretation, the biggest challenge, people love war stories. They love these kind of horrific stories. And it fits with what you were saying, Pedro, that some people are feeling a bit insecure, a bit daunted by the whole thing. So I sense that maybe psychologically, this is people saying, oh, you look like you're more or less a successful professional. So please tell me about your catastrophic fails so that I will feel better about myself. And I'm slightly caricaturing it there. I am actually happy to do that. So I'll maybe keep my catastrophic fail for the end. If you give me 1 minute at the end, I'll give you a catastrophic fail. But in the meantime, if there are another couple of questions we can take, otherwise I'll go straight there.
We will leave space for that last part. I have a question. We want the catastrophic fail. People are saying they want the catastrophic fail. What do you prefer when it comes to speakers? Fast talker or slow talker?
Again, it's probably a really irritating distinction. You know how everybody hates interpreters who answer every question with "it depends on the context." And I know I'm conscious of the fact that I've answered several questions with, well, I wouldn't actually look at it like that. I'd look at it a different way, or I wouldn't start from there. So again, here, I think there's real issue about what we mean by fast and slow. So this is not avoiding the question, but to say that what we perceive as a fast speaker can be an acoustic phenomenon, or it can be on a deeper level that somebody's a very fast thinker. So to rephrase it, do I prefer a fast or slow thinker? I think would be the crucial question for me as an interpreter. I don't care if somebody's superficially speaking fast, as many Spaniards do, so lots of syllables, but I don't mind lots of Spanish syllables because they're very often far fewer syllables in English. I was doing it the other way yesterday. Game workers. I was working for a game workers union, which, as I'm sure you all know, is un sindicato de trabajadoras y trabajadores de la industria de los videojuegos. Game workers union. So in terms of syllables, I don't mind Spanish syllables when I'm working into English. So it can be as fast as you like. Also, a lot of Spanish speakers will say everything 3 times, seems to be the rule. Say it once, say it again to make sure people have heard it. And then if nobody takes the microphone away from you, just say it a 3rd time, just in case, right? So if a Spanish speaker does that, I'm totally comfortable in the English booth, because as long as I've heard it once and understood it once, I can say it once slowly and calmly in the English booth, and the speed is irrelevant. And it really impresses people who don't understand Spanish, because they say, oh, wow, you stayed really cool and calm and the English sounded really succinct. But actually, you're cheating because of this thing that Spanish speakers know. But a quick, this is purely in the direction Spanish into English, okay, for now. The quick thinking Spanish speaker, I mean, I work mainly with Spaniards at the EU. Quick thinking Spanish speaker is a complete nightmare, because this, again, is, I think, more universal. Anyone who is quick at thinking and is genuinely jumping from one idea to another will be a nightmare to interpret in any language. Working from English into Spanish, this is compounded by the fact that they may need few syllables. So I will have to speak even faster in Spanish in order to keep up with a quick thinking English speaker. So the density of ideas and the quick speed of thought is the real deciding factor for me.
People, if you have any questions, now is the time. Unmute yourself. You can ask. And if not, I think it's time for the catastrophic fail story.
I've oversold this, probably. It's probably not quite as catastrophic or as interesting as you think. And some of you may have heard this already. But anyway, so I was starting out, and this was Spanish presidency of the EU. So that means the meeting was chaired in Spanish, and a lot of the audience was dependent on the English booth. And they were talking about drafting a document, and the chair said, como saben, hay unas ninfas etéreas que ayudan con la redacción de los documentos. And I'm fresh out of interpreting school, but for the reasons I described, my background, I'm quite sensitive to body language. I'm quite comfortable with humor. And I'm just looking at him and thinking, well, I've got the word ethereal nymph and I've got some context. I think I know why he's saying it, right? So I was trying to do this thing of say why, not what. So I thought, if I say ethereal nymphs, everybody's going to be confused. So I tried to follow this technique that I'd been trained in to intelligently say what I thought it meant. So I said, as you know, sometimes there is a fairy godmother who helps with the drafting of documents. And I felt, and nothing happened. Like the world didn't come to an end. So I thought, phew, you know, that worked. I've got away with it. And he then said, en este caso fui yo. So having said fairy godmother, there's this sort of grey-haired man of about 65 in a grey suit, a room full of grey white men, as it was in those days. One of the grey-haired white men had said, in my version, had said he was a fairy godmother. So, I mean, I suppose in his version, he'd said he was an ethereal nymph, but still, I was conscious I'd just said godmother, so I had to say, in this case, a fairy godfather, because it was me. Anyway, and, you know, tried to get on with the meeting. And again, nothing particular happened. We got on with the meeting. So I thought it had all gone okay. We broke for lunch. We came back from lunch and he said, I hope everybody's had a nice lunch. And the UK delegate put up his hand. He said, sí, Reino Unido. And he takes the mic and he says, no, Mr. Chairman, I have not had a nice lunch because my digestion has been disturbed by visions of you in a tutu waving a magic wand. So I thought I'd been clever, and the only person who understood the poor British delegate's joke was me, because only I knew why he was seeing a tutu. And I knew it was all my fault. And I had to go to the Spanish booth and say, look, you may be wondering why he said that. It was all my fault. I'm sorry. And yeah, so that was my introduction to the sort of the pragmatics of how you can even think that you've done something intelligent, but you're still working with human beings. And the other lesson I got from that is that anything unusual appeals because it appeals to people's imagination. But what had been a success, I'd made my listener think the speaker had really said that, which in some ways is a success. If it isn't actually literally what the speaker has said, then it's not so much of a success.
That was I laughed really, really hard. But you were very clever, I think. Okay, so if there's no more question, I think it's time for Matthew to start enjoying his weekend. And Matthew, thank you so much for doing this, for being here, for being with us for so long, almost an hour and a half. We have people from all kinds of places, so we're very happy. I've asked those of you who are trainers to share your email addresses over there so that we can exchange some materials for training processes. I think it's a good thing that may come out of this meeting now that we have the chance to meet up with each other and talk to each other. And I know that thanks to Matthew, now we know that we share the same problems and the same solutions, and we share a lot of things. Okay, independently from where we are, we share a lot of things. Matthew, once again, thank you so much. I hope you had a good time.
It was great fun. Yes, thank you for the invitation. Lovely to see everybody. Lovely to see you now for the screenshot. And like I say, do stay in touch. I'd be interested too in continuing this conversation between trainers and indeed between everyone. You mentioned earlier that you were going to do a role play when you asked me a question about the student's perspective and so on. And I find it really helpful for trainers to play the role of students, but the reverse too. So not just helping students give each other feedback and give each other speeches, but to say, how would you as a student go about assessing whether this has worked or not? And often when students say, what would you do in this situation, kind of professional ethics thing, what should an interpreter do? Just turn it back and put the student in that situation and say, you're the delegate, what do you want your interpreter to do? And very often they will answer their own question. So to a trainer too, I can often say, put yourself in the student's position. What would you want your trainer to do? So by all of us kind of coming together and discussing and putting on our different hat for a moment and playing that role, I think we can all learn from each other. I hope so. Anyway, even with this short time available.